Okay. Our next speaker is a young and very bright Dr. Soundarya from a Coimbatore branch of the Eye Foundation Group of Hospitals, and who's a cornea, cataract, and refractive surgeon and a very questioning mind. So let's go on to hear her talk on planning of topo-guided treatments in irregular corneas. I think you're going to have an avalanche of questions on this. On to you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Very good evening to all the respected panelists and speakers. So I'm going to be talking about planning of topography-guided treatment in irregular corneas. So as we all know, the efficacy of CXL is well established in stabilizing and arresting the progression of keratoconus. However, these patients post-procedure are still left with corneal surface irregularities and aberrations, which lead to a poor quality of vision. So this is where topography-guided treatment comes into play. The basic idea behind the treatment is to simultaneously produce two types of ablations. So one is going to be the myopic ablation at the apex of the cone, which is going to lead to a flattening, and a hyperopic arcuate ablation, which is going to be happening in the mid-periphery. So the final result is going to be a flatter and a broader cone, which is going to provide a better visual quality for the patient. So the aim of topography-guided treatment in these cases is purely regularization and not emmetropia. That is something that we need to remember. Before going into the step-by-step planning, I'd just like to talk about the few prerequisites that are needed. So ideal candidates for topography-guided treatment are those with mild to moderate keratoconus with a minimum preoperative thickness of 450 microns. Or in other words, an intraoperative residual stromal bed following the ablation, following the epithelial removal, a 350 micron residual bed, or postoperatively following the reepithelialization of 400 micron residual corneal thickness. So it doesn't mean that we cannot do topography guided treatment in those who have less than 450 microns. We do go ahead and do, but we have to keep in mind that an adequate residual stromal bed is available. So again, coming to timing of procedure, whether to do a simultaneous along with cross-linking or do it post cross-linking, there are various advantages of doing it as a simultaneous procedure. One, of course, is the reduced time of away from work for the patient, and possible reduction in haze formation, because the cross-linking per se is going to cause a keratocyte apoptosis, which reduces the number of fibroblasts that are going to be migrating. So this is going to lead to a lesser haze formation. And also a possible enhanced riboflavin penetration into the stroma, because here we're going to also be removing the Bowman's membrane. Again, accelerated protocols have shown to produce lesser haze and a lesser flattening effect, thus a lesser hyperopic shift. So when we're combining it with topography guided treatment, the amount of undercorrection that we do can also be lesser. And when coming to epithelial removal, we all know that keratoponic eyes have variable epithelial thickness, that is thinner over the apex and thicker over the base. So when we're doing a manual debridement, it is going to cause a variable amount of removal of epithelium. So what we have measured preoperatively, the surface is going to look totally different from what we are going to be treating following the epithelial removal. So keeping that in mind, a PTK may have a better role because it removes the epithelium uniformly throughout. So whatever surface that we're left with is going to mimic more closely the preoperative surface that we planned it with. So what is the maximum amount of tissue that we can ablate? We usually go up to 50 to 60 microns, but there have been reports that have gone up to 80 microns, provided that an adequate amount of tissue is available. And unlike the refractive procedures, here we tend to decrease the optic zone to 6 or even 5.5 mm as a tissue saving measure. And a minimum of 6 repeatable good quality images are usually required. This is going to be the first screen, as Vavikar sir has excellently put. So we're going to be taking at least a minimum of 6 scans, and to reduce the mean deviation, here again, we don't look for a mean deviation of 0. We usually try to keep it less than 0.1. So here we try to eliminate any outlying scans so that we reduce the mean deviation values. And in extremely irregular cornea, sometimes the Q values can be higher. In those cases, we can manually reduce the Q value in order to obtain the scans. This is going to be the next page where we're going to be entering the subjective refraction values, the pupillary diameter, and the pachymetry values, the central and the 6 mm pachymetry values. First, we're going to be entering, putting the target as 0 power. So this is going to generate an ablation profile, which basically gives us what is going to be the correction to correct the irregularities, as well as the myopic and hyperopic ablation that I was talking about. So here we can also compare it with the anterior sagittal curvature map. So where we can see the myopic ablation at the steepest point and an arcuate hyperopic ablation that is happening. And we can note the amount of tissue that is being utilized for the same. Once that is done, then based on the tissue remaining, we can plan on the refractive error debulking. So the idea is to first debulk the cylinder as much as possible. And then if tissue is available, we go ahead and debulk the spherical error. So when we're debulking the spherical error, we need to keep in mind that we need to have some amount of undercorrection in order to compensate for the flattening effect of the crosslinking. This is a very straightforward example where the refraction, the subjective refraction and the measured cylinders are in magnitude as well as in axis are correlating well. So we go ahead and enter that. And here we've done a 0.5 undercorrection of the sphere as well. And we've made a 6 mm optic zoom. However, this is not going to be the case in all patients with keratoconus because majority of these eyes are going to have a higher measured cylinder because of the irregularity. As in this case, we can see the measured cylinder is about -6. So we can go ahead. We usually in irregular corneas, unlike the Contera planning, here we tend to lean towards the topographic cylinder, both in magnitude as well as in the axis. So here we can see the axis is also quite different, but we go ahead and correct the topographic axis. So we can, again, here we have reduced the optic zone to 5.5 in order to save tissue. Here tissue was not available sufficiently, so we have not gone and done a spherical correction, but we can do a spherical correction if tissue is available. But we really need to keep in mind that we do not exceed the spherical equivalent of the subjective refraction that the patient was initially accepting. And if we have a doubt regarding the axis, we can also go ahead and compare it with the front elevation where we join the steepest point with the central point and see that the steep axis correlates with what ablation that we're going to be doing. This is the post-operative image of the same patient where the BCVA and the UCVA has improved well, and there's a very good debulking of both spherical and cylindrical errors. So another tip to reduce the amount of tissue that we're ablating is to add a small amount of hyperopic correction. In the example that I have given, the patient has a central flat cornea. In many of these patients, they will, in subjective refraction itself, they would accept hyperopia. So it's a good idea to go ahead and add that hyperopic correction as well. And even if patients don't accept a hyperopia, a minimal amount of hyperopic error can be added in order to save the tissue. So here we've added a minus, if we just put the cylindrical correction, the tissue used is 59 microns, whereas when we add the +1, the tissue reduction, the consumption has reduced quite significantly. This, I just wanted to show these two examples because we need to be, these are little tricky cases where the ISA symmetry is quite high. So here we can see the ISA symmetry is around 10 diopters. And this is another example, a similar example where the ISA symmetry is quite high. In these cases, as we can see, the clear arcuate hyperopic correction is happening. So what is going to happen in the post-operative period is the flat cornea in the center is going to become steeper. So what this will do is the patient's BCVA and the quality of vision will definitely improve. As we can see, there's a very beautiful regularization in the cornea. However, there's going to be a myopic induction. So this has to be explained to the patient prior. Coming to centered versus decentered cones, both have shown good results, but based on the UDVA, the centered cones may do a little better than the decentered cones, but these are just two examples of how well both centered and decentered cones do. This was a centered cone, as we can see, with a 3.75 cylinder with a 6.9 BCVA, which improved to 6.6 with just a 0.5 diopter cylinder. An example of a decentered cone, as we can see in the posterior float, it's quite decentered, and a -3 diopter cylinder with a 6.9 vision, which is regularized quite well, and the patient was has a vision of plano 6. And coming to the use of mitomycin C, definitely to reduce the post-operative haze, but there have been conflicting views, and Quinones et al. have reported that favorable outcomes have been there even without mitomycin C. But we in our center routinely use 0.02% of mitomycin C for a minimum of 30 seconds. And when we talk about stability, Kanellopoulos et al. Have published the 10-year outcomes in 144 eyes, and they have shown good keratometric and visual stability, with only 3.5% of the eyes developing a progressive flattening or a hyperopic shift. And the new arena that can be taken up is the customized cross-linking combined with topography-guided treatment. The initial results have also been good. Other than keratoconus, topography-guided treatment, as Praveen sir told, can be used in all these other irregular corneas as well. So in other ectatic disorders like pellucid marginal degeneration and our iatrogenic post-LASIK ectasias, the only difference in ectasia is that once the patient has already undergone a LASIK, the amount of tissue available may be lesser. And in other iatrogenic irregularities like decentered ablation, small optic zones, and post-RK and PK eyes also, results have been good. A small example to conclude, this was a post-SMILE patient.
1 minute remaining, ma'am.
Yeah, who presented 1 year later with a retained lenticule. So with a very highly irregular cornea, so we had planned for a 2-stage procedure in this patient. So here we did just a topographic regularization, and the patient was doing very well. She had a UCV of 624 prior to the procedure, which improved to 612, and which was left with a 0.75 sphere and cylinder, and she was planned for a second stage of a wavefront optimized PRK. So to conclude, topography guided treatment is a very promising procedure, especially in cases of early to moderate keratoconus, and it definitely does provide some degree of spectacle independence and also helps very much in improving the quality of vision in these patients. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Soundarya. You could stop sharing your screen. You did throw light on very many aspects, and I think we should lessen our question. Well, we have many more speakers to go, but I thought I'll take one question. I'll ask Praveen to take one. This is a question to the expert panel, but any of the speakers could take it too. Would you think of doing a topo-guided treatment if there is a large inferior-superior asymmetry? Like if a patient needs intacs but cannot afford intacs, would we do a topo-guided treatment in these? Of course, we do know that there's going to be a challenge in getting a repeatability of scans when there is so much of asymmetry. But some thoughts on that. Even Praveen, you could answer. Yes, Dr. Bhavikar, you want to answer what? Yes?
I think the indications for intacs and indications for topo-guided PRK are different. If the K is more than 55, 56, then I would think of intacs first. And if it is, say, less than 55, so basically topo-guided PRK will work in mild to moderate cornea keratoconus, whereas if it is a case of severe keratoconus, where you want to improve the tear film stability also, get the refractive error down, and at the same time improve the stability of the cornea, then I would go with intacs. So I agree with
a difference. No, I know the indications for intacs and indications for topo-guided PRK. I'm just asking if the asymmetry is more, would you want to go and do a little bit of smoothing in these eyes if the corneal tissue allows?
If the reading is more than 56, I will not do topo-guided. Perhaps I will not do topo-guided PRK.
Dr. Praveen?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of asymmetry certainly would be beneficial. But then again, like I said, unfortunately, it is not refractively entirely predictable if you do one. So if your goal is to reduce the quantum of the error, yeah, by all means. But if the goal is to be refractively neutral, then probably that's not going to work.
I had just one basic question, which I've never been able to sort of digest till so far, is that we are all so concerned about post-LASIK ectasia and so many indices, biomechanical strength, etc. And here is a patient who's already destined to have a weak cornea, however much it is strengthened by cross-linking. We have saved it from getting worse, and now we want to add the ginger spice of ablating it and probably triggering it. So logically it sounds very obvious that there is obviously a higher chance of creating more ectasia if you ablate a already weaker cornea compared to a stronger cornea. So what would be the thoughts of everyone on this?
No, I'm quite convinced that removal of some amount of tissue like a 50-60 micron when you're doing a full-blown cross-linking, because you're making the corneal surface more regular and it can better deal with the biomechanical stress and strain than one kind of a focal cone. So when you're able to make it more symmetric, you're improving the visual quality and you have enough conviction that the cross-linking will take care, and it's a larger, broader cone with better biomechanics. So why not we do it? I mean, I don't know whether I'm convincing enough, but we have enough and more results over the years to be completely sure that it has definitely been good for our patients. I'm sure Dr. Praveen also does a whole lot of cases. Would you want to say something here?
No, I think I agree with you about the fact that since we're doing cross-linking, I think that is why we do the added PRK. And I always emphasize this point for the fellows as well. It's not that you will cross-link the cornea because you want to do PRK. It is that you're doing PRK because you're doing cross-linking anyway, from the point of view of reducing the quantum of the refractive error. And from that perspective, that again follows the philosophy that we follow, that if you don't make a cut on the cornea, and this I believe in quite strongly, I don't think you really increase the potential for ectasia because of ablating some amount of tissue, which is the reason why I think it is still justifiable to do PRK in a patient who has keratoconus, with the added advantage of the fact that you're cross-linking in a case that you're doing cross-linking as a primary procedure, not PRK as a primary procedure.
May I ask a question? There are many people here who have done a lot of topo-guided PRK with cross-linking. Have any of you had an ectasia worsening after this procedure?
We have not seen, yes.
Not really.
Not
Two aspects. I think one is regression of the effect of what you've done. I mean, that is something that you tend to see. But then again, if you do it in slightly older individuals, more than 18 years, I don't think we've seen that either.
No, just to add on to what was already said, actually we have to, cross-linking, as we know, we do a full strength cross-linking when we are doing it with with the topo-guided treatment. And in these cases, that the strengthening of the cornea to the extent of about 360%. And the little amount of tissue that you remove, less than 50 microns. And it's also a bimodal treatment where you are steepening the flat area and flattening the steep area so as to regularize the cornea. Actually, right now in our practice, we hardly ever do CXL alone. Most often it's combined with PRK or with the Intacs, so that CXL essentially strengthens the cornea, stabilizes the cornea. And the second treatment that we offer essentially regularizes the cornea so that the best corrected visual acuity improves. It's really not, we are not looking at refractive accuracy here. We are looking at a more regular cornea which would accept glasses or contact lenses where there will be a improvement in the best corrected visual acuity. And most often we are able to achieve it. And basically in PRK extra is the PRK procedure, removal of the refractive error, which is the primary treatment. And the extra is an add-on to prevent a future complication, possible complication. Here, I think the roles are reversed. As was said, in the topo-guided treatment with cross-linking, the cross-linking which is most important, and it's a full-strength cross-linking, though it's a rapid cross-linking that we do. And the topo-guided treatment is just an add-on to regularize the cornea to achieve a smoother surface. And at least in our experience, we have found that it's not that we achieve refractive accuracy, all these patients can do away with the glasses or contact lenses. Absolutely no. And we warn our patients about that. Most often they end up with a better best corrected visual acuity than what they initially started out with. And 6 months, year later, there have been quite a few patients where we have been able to offer a phakic intraocular lens for the correction of the residual refractive error, because the cornea is more regular, the cornea is stable. So I do feel that combining the two modalities does have a role to play in these irregular corneas.
The reason why I asked that was that there have been several articles which show that cross-linking continues to flatten the cornea for a few years after cross-linking is actually done. So yes, treating simultaneously, we are not even sure how much this corneal shape is going to change after cross-linking. I can understand if it is being done, say 3 years, 2-3 years down the line, when you're sure the cornea is stabilized and this is how the cone is likely to be behaving. But adding sort of this unpredictability of the flattening that the cross-linking is going to induce, which again is unpredictable, it just made that. But I think by all of your experience is much more than,
with accelerated cross-linking, unlike conventional cross-linking, the flattening is not that significant. We would come back to discussions. I'm going to just leave one question for you all to think on and answer if we have time. Would any of you think of doing full refractive correction if it's not very high for the form first keratoconus with full cross-linking protocol when the other eye has a frank KC? You all can think on this answer, and if we have time, we will discuss on that.